study on Camden and state-mandated charter schools and community voice. I've known Keith for 10 years, from when he was a master's degree student in our social studies education program. He's a rigorous scholar with a deep commitment to social justice for urban communities, and particularly for Camden, where he lives and works, where he is now an education program specialist, has been a high school social studies teacher, and we've worked as collaborators on several research projects together. I know he has a lot to share with us today on a topic that concerns all of us. It's very relevant and immediate, and I'm very excited to hear Keith present to you all today.
Good morning still. Well, thank you for joining me. It's good to see so many faces I've met over the course of the years, and obviously some new faces. I really appreciate you all being here. Hopefully I don't waste your time, and hopefully I say something that's worthwhile. So the title of our presentation for today is Better for Whom? Camden Perspectives on State-Mandated Renaissance Schools and Recent Camden Development. In a break from typical brown bag protocol, by trade I'm a classroom teacher, and usually when you say something that gets the students' attention, or if they have questions, they'll shoot their hands up. I know typically questions come at the end, but I would actually feel more comfortable if you guys have questions about something, just throw your hands up, and then we'll move forward like that. All right, so here's all about me. That young lady right next to me is my daughter. All right, so Better for Whom was my dissertation topic, and I defended it August 3rd, 2016. And my dissertation topic evolved from how to sort of optimize academic outcomes for specifically Puerto Rican students, because in my view, urban public schools do a very poor job in addressing the new growing demographic of Hispanic students, especially in the Northeast, Dominican and Puerto Rican students. And because my wife is Puerto Rican and my daughter is half black and half Puerto Rican, I wanted to find out what can we do to help sort of optimize this population and have them be as successful as possible in school. But then that sort of evolved into, in my tenure teaching, with all these sort of top-down reforms that were taking place, I wanted to look at how teachers are resisting. And then finally, after looking at more change in actually my city, I wanted to know what was going on in terms of the change in education, the change in the redevelopment, and the changes in public safety that are all happening around the same time in Camden, to zero it down to finally Better for Whom. I am a teacher at Camden High, and this is my 13th year in the profession. And I did not set out to be a teacher. This was not the job I dreamed of doing, though I love it now, and I loved it, since I started doing it. This was not the job, that I had in mind. I actually wanted to be an attorney. I tried to go to law school, but things happen. As you can see, my daughter was born in my senior year when I was 22 years old, and trying to sort of take care of a baby while studying for the LSAT was pretty difficult. And then because I had a daughter, I had to obviously try to find a job, because kids go to the bathroom, kids eat. So my first job, as you can see, was actually working at a factory, unpacking printers, 66-pound printers, and putting it on a sort of like conveyor belt. And I did that for 8 hours a day with a college degree. And in that sort of vein, in my mind, I was thinking, like, something's wrong with this here. I have a degree, and I'm unpacking printers right next to someone else who didn't go to college, didn't finish high school at all. So even back when I was 22, I realized something might be wrong with this picture. And then I also worked in nightclubs in Philadelphia as a promoter and planning parties. But something happened at that job. The nightclub was shut down following a stabbing. So the club was called Evolution, and in Evolution, some people it was notorious for the security not frisking people properly. And one night, someone stabbed someone else, and the club, I learned the next day, was shut down. Now at the time, between me working, at a factory through a temp service, unpacking printers, and me working this night job, that was the only source of income we had. So, and at one time we were sort of just relying on sort of government assistance, as you see, like food stamps, free, heating, dollar-a-day car insurance for now my wife, but then, my girlfriend, Head Start, Medicaid, Section 8. And when I realized that club was not going to be reopened, I really went home and cried, because that source of income that we relied on at least even twice a week, making about $100 a night, that $200 plus some other stuff sort of helped keep things moving along. And then that stream of income was gone. So after the tears, I realized I did graduate college with a history degree. So what can I do with a history degree? I started getting an education. I started doing it by substituting, and I first started substituting in the spring of '04. I got a permanent substitute job at Veterans Memorial Middle School in Camden, and then I started full-time teaching under emergency certification special needs students in '04, and I have been in the teaching game ever since. All right, I'm a resident of Camden in the Parkside section. I'm a husband, father, and Christian. I'm consumed with fighting for the disenfranchised residents of my city. So here are my presentation components. We're going to go to some framing quotes, the purpose of our study, the research questions, the theoretical frameworks, the methods, the study findings, and discussion. All right, so here's one framing quote, which I think is pretty important to sort of place where we are, where we're headed. Urban school reform is not about schools or reform. It is about land development. Black inner city residents are suspicious of school reform, particularly when it's attached to neighborhood revitalization, which they view as an imposition from external whites who are exclusively committed to using schools to recalculate urban land values at the expense of black children, parents, and communities. Right there in the background, what you're looking at is the North Camden community along State Street. And here's the other one. And so Norcross will become familiar with who he is later on. And so Norcross has turned his sights on all of Camden, America's poorest city. This is, quote, "We got to make it safer here and improve the quality of education or no one will move here. And anyone who achieves any measure of success won't stay." That man in the background is George Norcross, arguably the most powerful politician in the state, next to Governor Christie. So here are my arcing concepts over the course of the study. Hey, Dr. Hager. Here are my arcing concepts. One, who has the right to the city? Whose voices get to be heard? Who gets to participate in decision making? Who are the subjects? Who are the objects? And the power of sort of politicized, manufactured narrative and image making versus the silent, on the ground realities of Camden and Preston. And when giving the silence voice, what do they have to say? And that was the aim of my study. So understanding Renaissance schools. Renaissance schools essentially are takeover schools. They're just given a flowery name. All right. If you look between on the left takeover schools and the right Renaissance schools, you will see there's so much in common. They are virtually indistinguishable. These are not just sort of typical charter schools where the charter organization had to apply for the state to get a charter, and it's a collection of concerned residents and concerned educators to form a different brand of schooling. Pretty much what you have under these charter schools, under these Renaissance or takeover schools, are imposed CMO operated schools where the kids in the area are sort of automatically registered into that school. So what that looks like is you're a parent that lives in the North Camden community. They enforce or place a Renaissance school, which I will call takeover school, in your neighborhood. Your child is automatically enrolled in there whether you decide to put them in there or not. And there's all sorts of issues behind CMO management, charter schools in terms of no excuses, things like this, which we'll get into later on. But again, if you look at the comparison between the takeover school and the Renaissance school, we're calling Renaissance schools in Camden, you'll see they're virtually indistinguishable. In essence, as you see right there in the middle, in essence, Renaissance schools are takeover schools. So here's the purpose of the study. I wanted to understand how Camden's current and prospective residents perceive new imposed Renaissance schools and concurrent Camden redevelopment, because these things were taking place at the same time. The massive Camden redevelopment that's taking place is happening at the same time as the imposition of these Renaissance schools. And I also wanted to better understand how whether Renaissance schools impacts current and prospective residents' residential housing decisions. You typically hear in urban areas, the reason why urban areas cannot move forward and progress and revitalize is because the schools are so terrible, and middle class folks won't move there because the schools are so bad. And the sort of accepted ideas that people move where the schools are good, and again, we'll sort of unpack that later on. To learn, next was to learn what current and prospective residents think about Camden's public schools and school choice options in the city. Oftentimes, here's the narrative part, we hear that these communities are voting with their feet when they decide to go to a charter school. We hear that they think that these schools are terrible. But really, you actually hear very little from the residents themselves what they think about their schools. So my studies sort of tried to find out and elicit what they view, their views of the alternative options and the public schools, which you all are here are failing. I also wanted to ascertain resident and prospective residents' views on whether such massive redevelopment efforts in Camden and the imposition of Renaissance schools are linked or isolated occurrences. So do they think that the Renaissance schools that they forced down by law, forced on Camden by law, is simply and explicitly to improve education for Camden children, along with the sort of redevelopment, or are these sort of things linked in some way? And finally, I also wanted to allow the Camden community to speak. With plans in Camden often being decided and executed by the few with power and agency, the views of the community, who are often and overwhelmingly low-income Black and Hispanic people, their views often go ignored or unknown altogether. So here are the massive changes that have taken place from 2011 to today. So when we had the Urban Hope Act, and this was sort of jammed through in 5 weeks, and it's very, very rare that legislation goes through, our state assembly and the state senate and signed in the governor's desk in such, short order. So in 5 weeks, the Urban Hope Act was passed in December 2011. It was proposed in December 2011 and was passed in January 2012. And at the same time, and what this did was, it actually established the state the right to force these sort of CMO-operated schools into 3 urban areas: Newark, Trenton, and Camden. Camden is the only one that has taken motion on the Urban Hope Act. The other cities, Newark and Trenton, did nothing with them. The expansion of meds and eds and city acquisition of downtown and waterfront properties in 2011 as well. So the plan was, expand medical institution, expand educational institution, and by doing that, you'll improve property values, you'll get more job opportunities here in the city. And these things were happening also at the same time with the expansion of these Renaissance schools. You had the New Jersey Economic Opportunity Act and Grow New Jersey in 2013, dismantling of the Camden Police Department, and the creation of the new Camden County Metro in 2012 and 2013. We had a 140-year-old police force that the governor deliberately defunded, along with the mayor, to start up a county police force. Now, the county police force sounds like it polices the entire county. The county police force polices one city, and that city would be Camden. All right. So it's county police force in name only, not actually in function. In fact, when they tried to expand to other areas like Pennsauken, their residents had the right to vote, and they voted no. We don't want the expansion of a county police force. So that county police force is still only in Camden. Camden residents did not have the opportunity to vote on such an issue. In fact, the mayor sued the residents when the residents tried to petition to get that issue on the ballot as a referendum. So when the residents tried to have their voices heard by doing this sort of, traditional, ways of participating in democracy, our mayor sued us, and she won on the first level of court, but the appellate division, she lost. But the appellate court essentially said, well, the residents were right, but the county force is already established, so no sense, going back and redoing things. And then you have the demolition of public and affordable housing complexes, home inspections yielding fines and higher taxes. All this stuff is taking place right now. Rampant issuing of liens and outstanding utilities from 2013 to the present. All right, so a lot of residents in a variety of ways are sort of getting nudged out of their homes, all right, and off their properties. And we have a state takeover of Camden Public Schools, and an appointing of a state superintendent, Payman Rahanafard, in the spring of 2013. Camden City is the only city in the entire state with an all-appointed Board of Education under state takeover and with the state-appointed superintendent. There is no way for Camden residents to execute democracy inside their education system. Camden residents essentially have no voice and have no influence. And last thing, the establishing of the first of 15 Renaissance charter schools happened between 2013 to the present. So what you can see is within each 5-year span now, a lot of things have been taking place, a lot of change has been taking place in Camden. So here are my guiding research questions.
I have a question.
Yes?
What fraction of the properties are owned by the people living in them?
Camden overall is a rental city.
So the residents don't, property values don't help them.
Exactly, and if you guys get a chance to, Dr. Derek Hyra does in one of his pieces of literature, he actually compares the needs and wants of renters versus homeowners. And though they might live in the same areas, their goals and desires are not necessarily the same. And in some instances, they actually conflict. But that's a great question. Thank you. So how does the establishment of Renaissance charters influence current and prospective residents' decision to move into, stay in, or leave Camden? How do current residents of Camden, as well as prospective residents, interpret the opening of Renaissance schools? Who are Renaissance charters and recent Camden development intended to benefit? Are residents or prospective residents interested in sending their kids to these schools? And who do residents and prospective residents believe are making decisions concerning education and redevelopment in the city? So here, my theoretical framework is standpoint theory. This is simply to put forward the subjugated voices and interpretations concerning how dominant groups exert authority upon the subjected. Highlight perceptions of non-dominant groups whose views are often disregarded and ignored. The interesting thing about standpoint theory is that your focus of analysis will not necessarily be the same from one day to the next. It's all about where that person is compared to what's around them. So in terms of standpoint theory, depending where I'm at, I might be the center of analysis today, but if I'm in a completely different environment at a completely different time, I actually might be a part of the dominant group. So it is sort of important. It was important for me to actually see what these folks who are never really asked their opinions, who are not allowed to be included in certain decisions, how they feel about all these things that are going on around them. So this was a qualitative phenomenological methodology. The initial data collection was started through questionnaires where I went to local community groups and I gave questionnaires about the study, or actually I pitched the idea, and anyone who wanted to be interested or who was interested, I gave them questionnaires, collected them. And in terms of choosing the participants, we had 30, I had 23 that were current residents, and 7 were prospective residents. Now the prospective residents were folks who were kind of on the fence about living in Camden, or were living in Camden but just temporarily. So we have 23 folks who are long-term residents who they've been here, they have no plans of going anywhere. Those are folks who I consider for the study current residents. And we have prospective residents, again, folks who are considering moving. These folks might have been grad students. They might have been sort of like millennials who might be staying in the Victor building, or in Cooper Grant neighborhood. And most of the prospective residents were white. We have one Latina as a prospective resident. We held neighborhood focus groups at a little slice in New York that is right across the street from Rutgers. So that was to cater to the prospective resident group. So we sat down, had some slice of pizza, talked about these sorts of things, talked about these issues. And then in Corinne's place, that's in the Parkside neighborhood where I live at, and San Juan's, that is on Federal Street, that's in East Camden. All right. So individual interviews followed the focus groups in participants' homes and workplace. Yes.
How would you describe the neighborhoods for the other two places where you had to focus groups?
All right, so the Corinne Parkside neighborhood is almost majority black, and San Juan's in East Camden is almost entirely Hispanic.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. And the individual interviews happened in people's homes or in their workplace, wherever they felt comfortable. In fact, I had one interview where it was really like sort of deep throat-ish, where the guy was like, he had told me to meet him at a barber shop, and then he told me to go outside and interview him, and the interview took place in the rain, and it was nighttime. So he really didn't want other people to sort of like hear the things that he was saying, which was good, because I just wanted him to be comfortable in giving me his honest thoughts, It was kind of weird though, out there in the rain with a tape recorder. All right, so finding number 1 was skepticism and suspicion. So skepticism was from prospective residents that redevelopment plan using Renaissance schools as a lure to sort of draw them to Camden would actually be effective. All right, most of these folks, not most, unanimously, all the prospective residents said that this idea of bringing Renaissance schools or imposing Renaissance schools to help attract us to live in Canada. Now, mind you, the prospective residents, they're sort of your established professional millennials. All right, all these folks, unfortunately, this was actually one weakness in my research, is that none of these folks had children. And we'll see how that how it has an impact later on. But these are the folks that are that urban areas for the longest time have been trying to court. You know, mid-20s, mid-30s, white, professionals, you know, for them to permanently take up residence in urban areas. But these folks said that this is a horrible idea if they think that right there is going to attract us to move into Camden, or me or any of my friends to move to Camden. This idea is ridiculous. That's what they were thinking. And there's suspicion from current residents that Renaissance schools were to improve education for the city's children. They didn't believe that that's the case. They thought there was something more to it, like trying to get a money grab. Like, you know, they're trying to establish these schools to get money off our kids. Like, our kids in Canada get about like $26,000 per pupil. So maybe they sort of established, their thinking was maybe they sort of established these alternative schools and force them down, you know, the city's throat. It won't be going to the public school system, but it'll be enriching somebody else somewhere, or as a land grab to hopefully sort of induce gentrification. That was a view from folks the current residents of the city. Change is happening. They're recognizing that change is taking place in the city, but they don't view the change as being for the people here in Camden. So residents and prospective residents recognize that a change in public safety, plans for corporations to arrive in Camden, and increased school choice. So they recognize that these things are there. Residents also believe that the changes that they're witnessing are not intended to benefit them, as commonly stated by those in power. So you commonly hear that we're doing certain things for the neighborhood, we're doing these certain things for the people, but the residents aren't convinced at all. They reported that what stood out in terms of the change in looking at the police force, they talked about the whitening of the police force, like the police force in Canada before the governor collapsed it and the governor and the mayor collapsed the police force, it was 70% minority. And most of those minorities actually either lived in the city or grew up in the city. Now it's 44% minority. And that's a huge drop. And a lot of the folks who are on the police force are young, they're white, and they're from as far as Ocean County, and really have no attachment to the local community. And that does not necessarily sit well with the residents. They also lament the popping up of charter schools everywhere, and at the same time these charter schools, these Renaissance schools are popping up, public schools are being forcibly closed, again without public input. Now, I just have to say this right now. Today, the State Board of Education is deciding whether they're going to destroy and close Camden High School. Today. Camden High School is the one unifying force, or the one unifying entity in the city. And that's also the school I teach at. That's also the high school in my neighborhood. So we'll get more into sort of discussing and sort of unpacking that we've actually seen this sort of stuff before, but the idea that folks from someplace else have so much influence over what goes on educationally and what our neighborhoods look like, for me is completely, you know, upsetting. But you know, this is not sort of a dead issue or past thing that, you know, took place in the past and not lit live. This is happening right now. In fact, the mayor is giving a speech at Camden High School, sort of announcing that this thing is going to go through. And you know, myself and a couple residents are going to try to band together to sort of try to resist it. But you know, this is the state we're in. Prospective residents are noticing that similar changes are taking place, and can see that their belief that the changes are likely to attract people like them, not necessarily for the residents that are already there. So imagine, like, you as a millennial are coming into Camden, you actually are pointing all these changes, you're identifying all these changes that are taking place. They're conceding in the study, they concede that, you know what, this stuff is probably not for the folks who have already been here, but it's probably for, you know, for me and trying to sort of court us, you know, to sort of living in Camden. The influence of outsiders and George Norcross is another finding that was apparent across the data, is that both current and prospective residents agree that decisions in Camden largely are made not by residents or with resident input, and further they identified the active presence of non-Camden actors and policymakers as decision makers in the city that impose their vision on Camden and its citizens. Most prominently identified across the study was the outside actor by far was George Norcross. George Norcross runs the local or South Jersey Democratic machine, which is very, very effective and has power consolidated and concentrated pretty much with him and pretty much his cronies. and it is very, very hard, very, very difficult to run against him politically, and it's very, very hard to advance the agenda of the local community because politically he's so powerful. And that was apparent across prospective residents and current residents. The participants of public schools and school choice in Camden. They view how they viewed Camden public schools and school choices was very much impacted by the way they came to know public schools. So current residents who attended public schools themselves and have children in schools overwhelmingly reported positive feelings about schools. One, that surprised me. When I was interviewing these folks, I thought that they were going to say, you know, our schools are terrible, our schools are, you know, are bad, and, you know, we need, you know, X, Y, and Z, we need to take these measures. But here's one quote. Before all this new testing crap, you know, when these tests became the barometer of success in education and all these charter schools became in vogue, and certainly when I was coming along, and while my daughters went through school here, Camden schools were excellent in my view. Look at all the successful people that had come through here. We had astronauts, scientists, Grammy Award winners, NBA and NFL players. What other city, this size especially, has so many successful people come out of these schools? Now all of a sudden, all they want to talk about is how bad our schools are. How do you think all those people got successful that way? They came through our schools and our teachers taught them. Please don't stop working. And stop working. So I guess I'll use this. See if this works. All right, here we go. Current residents who did not attend Camden schools and get most of their information from reading the newspaper or watching the news had extremely negative views about Camden schools. Now here's one quote. I don't personally know much about Camden schools because I'm not actually from here. I grew up in Wildwood and I lived in New York just before I came here to Camden. I hear all these schools are terrible. Just look at the test scores. I remember I heard someone say at the high, talking about this, referring to the school I teach at, only 3 people graduated. That's crazy. How can anyone tolerate 3 people graduating out of an entire high school? Then I heard the governor on the news say only 3 people in the entire graduating class in Camden last year were college ready. The people in those schools must not be doing shit. Now, let's pause right there for 1 second. Our schools have been described by the governor and by Norcross, and I'm sure by others, as sewers, as prison pipelines, failure factories. Keep in mind, children also attend these schools, and children also hear the comments that are made about those schools. And children also, unfortunately, are demeaned and feel hurt by the things that they're saying because they think ostensibly they're talking about themselves. They're talking about the children as well. I mean, if you're going to a school and your school is a failure factory, what do you think they're saying about you? Understand? Now, the interesting case about Tina is that Tina now, I teach her son. Her children weren't in Camden Public Schools when I did this, and I hadn't known her. But I teach her son, Milo, who's a great kid, and her opinions of Camden School, now she actually had to deal with it, change. Her son was actually put out at Camden Catholic High School, unfortunately. But, now I actually teach him, and, she's a little bit more positive on our school system. Our prospective residents, at least conceptually, remember, yes?
I'm sorry, is it true? I mean, it's not true that only 3 kids graduated.
No.
Right? Can you speak about that?
Okay, so what the governor was saying was that this is what she heard. And hearsay, when you don't have sort of direct contact, goes a long way with folks you don't really know and aren't really informed. What the governor was referencing, in the State of the State address, he said that only 3% of Camden seniors were deemed college ready, as judged by the SAT score of them scoring a 1550. What the governor neglected to announce was that I think only about 44% of the entire graduating population scored that 1550 or were deemed college ready. What he did was singled out Camden, which is the poorest city in the state, the most impoverished city in the state, and possibly the most crime-ridden, per capita in the state, and use our city as an example to sort of pillory, in front of the nation. So that's what she was referencing. All right, so so there we go. All right, so prospective residents, at least conceptually, were extremely supportive of the idea of sending their future children to Camden Public Schools as a way to become part of the Camden community. I would send my hypothetical kids to any public school here, because that's how you become part of the community, primarily through schools during childhood. I know he or she would probably be the only white kids in the building, but honestly, it would probably do wonders for their worldview. To be white and educated in Camden with Camden kids, how many white kids experience that? The reality is, with my occupation and my wife's money, it's really not too much of a concern, thankfully, but I don't want my kid to grow up to be a suburbanist jerk, completely shut off from the realities that other people live, or even cloistered from it. I think the experience would make him much more well-rounded. This was a sentiment that was largely across the data, but one of the weaknesses in my research was that I wasn't meticulous enough to specifically flesh out prospective residents with children. Because while conceptually they are welcome, the idea of sort of inclusivity and sort of economic and racial integration inside these public school classrooms, what happens when actually you're really faced with the decision, they may not necessarily be the same thing. And I should have paid attention to that. So Camden parents who do utilize school choice in Camden do so for a variety of primarily non-academic reasons. There are about 15,000 K-12 students in Camden. 9,000 attend public schools, and that leaves about 6,000 amongst the Renaissance / takeover schools and the charter schools. So obviously there are some parents who are, in some cases, choosing to send their kids to alternative sites for education to public schools. But they're for a variety of reasons. We typically hear they're upset about poor teacher, they're upset about lazy teachers, they're upset about failing schools, their test scores, and all sorts of stuff. Well, let's find out a little bit what the parents had to say. One thing that jumped out was that there was enormous prejudice among parents who send their kids to charter schools. There was enormous prejudices against the other kids who they think attend public schools, and the other students' parents who they think send their kids to public schools. So here's one quote. First of all, this is America. We're not all meant to make it from the rip, which means from the beginning. But look at these kids here. Some of them are smoking marijuana already. Some of them are having babies already, staying out all night, running the streets, selling drugs and all that. I know that because I lived it too. I went to school here. I know what's going on. And as much as they say it's a teacher's fault, the teachers don't care and all that, that ain't true. It's the kids and their parents. And this was very consistent as well, is that some parents are sending their kids to avoid what they either consider the bad kids or the influence of bad parents who they think are in public schools. So there is some sort of self-segregation that's taking place in these decisions, which is not necessarily driven by academics. Camden parents who do utilize school choice in Camden do so for a variety of non-academic reasons, like athletic opportunities. Like, for instance, if someone wanted their child to play football at Camden High School, and Camden High School's football team they are very good. So how do you get your child, on the football team and to play for, to live out his dream of playing high school sports? Well, if you're not going to play at Camden High School, you have to transfer him and send him someplace else, which has happened, specifically for football and for basketball. Proximity to their homes. With as many sort of takeover and charter schools that they're imposing on neighborhoods, sometimes the school that they're placing in neighborhoods are actually closer than the school that their kid went to before. So, as a parent, are you going to pass this one school because you have an allegiance to the public school? Some might, but most of us, especially in a community where some folks might not have cars, they might have reliable transportation, they'll send their child to the closest school. So, in the research, I've heard a few times, I'm sending my kid to school because it's the closest one. It's right there. Also, a lot of these schools have courted parents in a certain type of way where public schools have not, in terms of getting their attention and drawing them into their building. So through barbecues, which you'll be surprised how far hamburgers and hot dogs in the summer day goes with parents. Free gift cards to Wawa, the promise of laptops and tablets, specifically to parents who or households that don't have that sort of technology. That stuff goes a long way. And also, lastly, the fact that their public school was actually taken over by the Renaissance school. And here's what we have. Really, I don't understand the difference between public and charter schools. I mean, they're both free, and the building is still the same building. So to me, when the school became a mastery, was one of the CMOs, it was like the same school, just with some different people and a different name. It wasn't like I went out and chose Master. I didn't do that. I didn't have any complaints about the old school, which was Molina Elementary School. That's in North Camden. Like I said, to me, it's still Molina because he didn't have to actually change the school building. Now let's pause right there for a second. The initial HOPE Act said, well, part of the rationale behind the initial HOPE Act is this would be a mechanism for this poor community, Camden, that has not had any new schools built. It would be a mechanism for them to get new modern schools. And new modern schools or significantly renovated buildings. But what happened was that part didn't follow through. And out of the 7 charter schools, out of the 7 Renaissance/takeover schools that are there, only 1 was built. The rest of them were forced in already existing buildings where students were already going. So you also typically hear about the narrative where these parents are choosing high quality options, but really that's not what happened. What happened was they simply just changed the name of the building and took over its sort of governance structure and things like that. But from the function of kids and their parents, it's still the same building. They just took over the name. So all of a sudden, if Rutgers just became Villanova, you guys didn't choose to go to Villanova. You just changed the name. And that happened. That was the majority of the case. Is that these parents didn't actually choose these Renaissance or takeover schools. And 5.
Are they keeping the?
Oh, sorry.
Did they replace the teachers as well?
Yeah, they did replace the teachers. All the every teacher was ripped, but had the opportunity to interview. Now, out of those interviewed, very little got rehired. Was there anything else I want to say about that?
Are they ununionized, the Renaissance schools, or are they?
Okay, so part of which was a sticking point, would they be allowed to unionize? And there was a while that there was language saying that they would be allowed to unionize, but thus far there is none. So both current and prospective residents believe the imposition of Renaissance schools is connected to a larger citywide development plan that includes displacement of residents and gentrification. When Tiana was asked if she sees any reason the Renaissance schools were established during a time of such substantial change in public safety and development, she replied, "I just heard that they were better, but I think they want to take Camden back like they used to be. You know, the politicians. You know, it's all about the money with them and the waterfront and the rebuilding all down there. I think it's about them people trying to get the problems, referring to people, out of Camden and bring in other people. I think it's basically designed to get people out of Camden and bring in white folks. Trying to get rid of street people. I guess that's why they're coming. This stuff was planned for a minute." Now, what you're seeing in the background, this is the groundbreaking of the 76ers facility that was established in Camden, and this was just last week. And as you can see, if you look really clearly, there is no community members right here. All right? And here's the discussion. The result of this study can contribute to a broader urban planning and urban education reform policy that ordinarily ignores low-income minority residents by imposing neoliberal education reforms supposedly for urban communities, in order to execute neoliberal urban planning upon urban communities for the benefit of others. What's typically communicated and often assumed as to why school choice is exercised in urban areas for better schools, for better teachers, and better curriculum may not be the reason parents choose them at all. While research does suggest that in certain places the establishment of charter schools does raise property values and does change the demographics of the city, like in Georgia, in North Carolina, and in New York City, and I can reference the specific studies, the case is not shown to actually be taking place or would actually work in a city like Camden, which is a lot less cosmopolitan and is a lot smaller. In New York City, obviously you have a population of about between 8 and 9 million people. It's the economic center of the Western world. So obviously the taking their tactics in terms of changing the neighborhood and using that for a population of a post-industrial city with a population of only 80,000 people, which is very poor. That might not necessarily be the best way to sort of change neighborhood conditions. And local residents do want to be included in decision-making processes when results impact them, and in Camden, this does not happen. And folks, that is my presentation. Yeah.
I think that's really interesting, so thank you. I have sort of 2 different questions. One is, were there any sort of counterexamples, or is there any success experience in Renaissance schools compared to the public school options? And then the second question is, how did the community deal with, it seems like there'd be a lot of police officers looking for jobs and a lot of teachers looking for jobs with the changes that have happened.
Okay, so the first question was there any comparative study between the Renaissance School performance and...
Is there a sort of was there any sort of success experience in the Renaissance schools that wasn't seen in the public schools, or parents that are happier in the charter schools?
Well, by the time the study was done, no data for the Renaissance schools were released. And the fact that Renaissance schools don't have to provide data for 5 years. So the idea that we're able to sort of just objectively compare, progress would be very difficult. I'm sure there was a way. I'm sure there was a way. I think last week there was an article that came out that said that Renaissance schools improve kids' test scores at a greater rate than Camden schools. But for me, test scores measure very little. It tries to quantify an education process and experience that really is not something that could effectively measure the experience and the learning that child goes through, and the experiential learning a child goes through. So that was reported just recently, but not at the time of that study. And you're saying, would there be an influx of folks trying to come for the police department and for the charter schools?
Just
Right.
that it seemed like a lot of people lost their jobs with these
What
happened to
transitions,
them?
and how did that affect?
Okay, so some folks were just laid off completely and did not have that. I mean, they might have interviewed, went through the process, and did not get hired, and have subsequently tried to find work in other areas. And that has happened. But most of these folks, most of the people who are staffed in even the Renaissance schools, they're very young folks right out of college. Typically, what you would see in no excuse charter schools, a lot of those folks are younger kids, and they're really working them like dogs in terms of micromanaging and taking sort of the professionalism out of their practice. And in terms of the police force, we have high turnover in the police force, because what's happening is folks are applying to be Camden County Metro Police Department officers, and they're going through the police training. What's happening is once they complete the training, they're going back to their neighborhood locality or the local police department. So, so the residents are actually paying for the training of officers who are performing their tasks back in their homes. And that's a huge problem in Camden, actually. So our department's really just leaking money because of that right there. Yes?
Excellent job. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question about media coverage.
Yes.
So what's going on there?
Okay, so for a while, George Norcross actually owned the Philadelphia Inquirer. So in the only other competing newspaper would be the Courier Post, which the Cooper Hospital, which I didn't get into the business aspect enough in terms of the development that I was talking to. He's the chairman of Cooper Hospital. Cooper Hospital is the biggest advertiser out of the Courier Post. So in terms of actually having media coverage that's worthwhile, that brings out residents' voices, that's critical in any way, there's very little of that at all. Every once in a while, the newspapers will put out there an editorial, but in terms of actually investigating what's going on and asking tough questions, that's not happening. Yes, Dr. Baker.
Do you have, I should know this, but do you have a breakout of the shift in the racial composition of the teacher workforce?
I do not.
I guess I'm wondering, I think Mark might have put it out there at some point, so I'll look it up.
Yeah, I do not, but sort of anecdotally, I do know people who work at, the Masteries and the Uncommons, and certainly the kids. A common complaint is they're saying like, yo, most of these teachers in here by far are young white females. And that's something I've heard across those different schools. But that I'm sure that's a very interesting question. As to what's going on. But I wouldn't be surprised if that was actually true across the schools.
Well, Mark and I haven't done it, but certainly.
All right.
We did it for Newark. And
Yeah.
that was very much the case.
Yeah.
Large numbers of senior, predominantly black teachers
Yep.
were dismissed and replaced with a substantially whiter and Asian, for that matter, workforce, which is what allowed the much higher percent of Asian teachers than previously existed, was something that was used actually as a media rebuttal. Diversity is increasing.
Yep.
And in fact, I'm engaged in a racially disparate impact lawsuit in the city of Chicago over the same issue.
Nice.
I mean, huge patterns of displacement of black teachers, replacement with predominantly white young teachers.
One thing I don't think I drilled down enough was that the initial target of the Over Hope Act was about one school. Was called Landing Square Elementary School, and in 2011, Landing Square Elementary School was determined to be structurally deficient and was closed down. Mind you, there had been the principal was there, the principal who was serving there, the teachers who were there were saying that there's really nothing wrong with our building. You know, like, why are you condemning our building? Why can't kids, you know, come there? What happened is after the building was condemned, the development of that area started to take place. They established a Rowan Medical School right there on Broadway, and they established the expansion of Cooper Hospital along Broadway was taking place, and Rutgers and the Rowan Health Sciences building was built on that same street. So there was really no way that land was going to come back there, and that's also a gentrifying neighborhood right now. There's no way that school was going to come back as a public school serving overwhelmingly minority, low-income children. So that school is now the Kip Cooper Norcross School. So that whole area is like that whole area has the imprint of George Norcross in that specific Landing Square neighborhood, and something very similar is taking place in my view. What's happening with Camden High School right now? They're saying that our building needs to be destroyed, and in 5 years, apparently it takes 5 years to build a school. In 5 years, a new school will be built there. But I also want to keep this in mind. Further down on the next block and further down the street, a new uncommon school, there's supposed to be a high school, is going to be built. So the suspicion is that they're trying to force and make sure these kids, this uncommon high school has a student body. Because Camden High School, like I said before, is a unifying force. Kids actually grow up excited to attend Camden High School. But now Camden High School is going to be no more for 5 years, so you're going to have a whole class of kids who never experienced Camden High School, thus sort of severing the tie between the community and that school. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I'm just, my concern about the media narrative and how it sort of impacts community members and perceptions in the city. I encounter some of this as well in Newark, where local constituents actually believe that these public schools are prison pipeline, they're failures, sewers, as you said. And what kind of prescription or sort of recommendation do you offer to policymakers, to local government, to community members to sort of battle this sort of perception and eradicate sort of these erroneous opinions?
Right. So what I would say is that, you know, across my research, that opinion was really based off of how folks experienced those schools. So people who went to Camden Public Schools, like I said, had kids in those schools, did not have that opinion at all. So really, for me, when I hear that, it really would be a matter of asking, okay, how much experience you have with the school, and how did you come to get this information? Some folks certainly agree that is the case. And large, like I said before, most of those folks are people who, you know, they never had these sort of experience in these schools. And in terms of actually having policymakers, if you want to sort of combat that narrative, what I would do, what I think would be effective, is actually getting people who actually have these sorts of connections. Because also in Newark, while people might have sort of adopted that sort of narrative that these schools are failing and need to be torn down, there's also what I've seen, viable pushback among residents and among students are saying, like, you know, we're willing to take to the streets to defend their schools that people deem as failing. So I don't think I don't think that's sort of a unanimous, view, even among folks who send their kids to a quote-unquote failing school. And actually, I am when my daughter goes to Cooper's Point, and it's considered to be a failing school, but she's happy, and I'm happy about what I see. So that would not be my opinion at all. I think there's certainly more digging to be done, you know what they think. Yes?
Yeah, I'm trying to understand something that's, so in the voices of the current residents.
Yes.
Maybe I kind of didn't quite get it. I heard that there was sort of skepticism about some of the changes, so that was like one of the themes potentially. But I didn't hear